gradual, persistent, easy to ignore until you are soaked. Most people are taught to think of inflation as a technical issue, a statistic, a number reported on the news. Prices going up because of supply chains, energy costs, or global events. Something unfortunate but temporary. Something that governments promise to fix. That understanding is incomplete. Inflation is not just an economic condition, it is a mechanism. And over time, it performs one very specific function with remarkable consistency. Prices rise, food costs more than it did last year. Rent adjusts upward. Transportation, utilities, insurance, everything inches higher. Individually, these increases seem manageable, annoying but survivable. Life goes on. Now consider income. Wages do not move the same way prices do. They are negotiated, reviewed, approved, and delayed. They rise slowly, if at all. When inflation accelerates, wages lag behind it. This gap is not a coincidence. It is structural. When prices rise faster than wages, purchasing power falls. Not suddenly, but steadily. You can afford slightly less each month, even though your paycheck looks the same. Sometimes it even looks bigger, but the math underneath has changed. This is the first transfer. Time transfers value from labor to pricing power. Businesses that can raise prices immediately protect themselves. Workers who must wait for raises absorb the loss. Over time, that loss compounds. From the outside, nothing dramatic happens. No collapse, no announcement. Just a quiet erosion of what income can do. Now look at savings. Saving money has long been framed as responsible behavior. Delay consumption, build security, prepare for the future. These ideas are deeply ingrained. Inflation reverses their reward. When inflation is low and stable, saving feels neutral. When inflation rises, saving becomes a liability. Cash loses value by design. The longer it sits, the less it can buy. This is not a flaw in the system. It is how the system is meant to function. Money that is not invested or leveraged decays. The decay rate is called inflation, but its effect is simple. Stored labor loses power over time. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, this erosion feels abstract. For someone with modest savings, it feels personal. Years of discipline quietly undone without a single bad decision. Meanwhile, those with access to assets respond differently. They do not hold cash. They convert it, stocks, property, businesses, land, anything that can reprice with inflation becomes a shield. When prices rise, asset values rise with them, often faster. Inflation does not punish asset holders, it protects them. This is the second transfer. Value moves from savers to owners. Now introduce debt. Debt behaves differently under inflation. A loan is a fixed promise. Inflation changes the value of what is repaid. As prices rise, the real burden of past debt falls. Each future payment is made with cheaper money. Now place these pieces together. Workers lose purchasing power as wages lag prices. Savers lose value as cash erodes. Asset holders gain as prices inflate. Debtors benefit as obligations shrink in real terms. The direction is not random. It is upward. This is why inflation is often called a hidden tax, but that phrase understates its precision. Taxes are visible. Inflation is ambient. It is felt everywhere and attributed to nowhere. Because inflation is blamed on forces rather than structures, it escapes moral scrutiny. Supply shocks, energy prices, global instability. These explanations may be true, but they are incomplete. They describe triggers, not outcomes. The outcome remains consistent across countries and decades. Wealth concentrates, not through confiscation, not through force, but through design. The middle class experiences this most acutely because it occupies the most exposed position in the system. Middle-income households earn wages, hold some savings, and rely on access to debt. They are pulled in every direction at once. This is why inflation is rarely discussed in terms of power. It is framed as a technical challenge rather than a political tool, yet its effects are more reliable than many laws. It does not require enforcement. It does not require persuasion. It only requires time, and time always moves in one direction. By the time inflation becomes a public concern, the distributional shift is already locked in. Asset prices have adjusted. Debt burdens have eased for issuers. Savings have thinned. Labor has absorbed the cost.
Many think that economic collapse happens with a sudden, dramatic crash, but often it's a slow, creeping process of normalization. By the time inflation is woven into the fabric of our daily lives, the system has already adapted. Prices update automatically, contracts anticipate it, and markets expect it. What once felt like a temporary problem becomes a permanent assumption. This is the point where inflation stops being a symptom and starts acting as the very infrastructure of our economy. To understand why, you have to look at what modern economies are really built on: debt. Debt isn't just a financial tool, it's the foundation of growth. It's how future output is promised today. Governments borrow to spend, corporations borrow to expand, and households borrow to participate in the economy. But this entire structure relies on one critical condition: tomorrow's money must be worth less than today's. Inflation provides that exact condition. Without it, debt gets heavier over time. With it, debt gets lighter. The difference is existential. A debt-based system without inflation eventually grinds to a halt. Obligations pile up faster than the ability to pay them. Defaults rise, and growth stalls. Stability breaks. So, inflation isn't just tolerated, it is required. Once that requirement is in place, the system must ensure inflation continues, even when it hurts the very people who produce the real economy. This is where control comes into play. And control doesn't mean brute force, it means dependency. Inflation creates dependency by narrowing our choices. As your purchasing power shrinks, you're pushed toward credit just to maintain your standard of living. Credit cards, personal loans, financing plans. Buy now, pay later. Each option feels voluntary, but each one deepens your reliance on the system. Debt fills the gap that inflation creates. This isn't an accident, it's the feedback loop that keeps the economic engine running. As inflation eats away at wages, borrowing steps in to replace income growth. As borrowing increases, the whole system becomes more sensitive to interest rates. And as that sensitivity grows, policy decisions gain enormous leverage over our everyday lives. Control becomes indirect, but it's everywhere. Now, let's look at asset ownership. Assets aren't just stores of value, they are sources of power. They generate income, they appreciate with inflation, and they can be leveraged for even more credit. Those who own assets are not only shielded from inflation's damage but are positioned to profit from it. Those who don't own assets are completely exposed. Over time, this divide becomes a chasm. Inflation raises the barrier to entry for everyone else. Housing prices skyrocket, outpacing wages. Investing requires capital that most people's savings can no longer provide. Ownership starts to become something you inherit rather than something you earn. Opportunity narrows, even as the language of opportunity remains the same. The system keeps telling us the same old story: work hard, save responsibly, invest wisely. But inflation has quietly changed what those words actually mean. Hard work now just helps you maintain your position, not make progress. Saving preserves your habits, but not the value of your money. And investing requires access that many people simply don't have anymore. The promise stays the same, but the outcome is radically different. At this stage, inflation takes on a second function beyond just transferring wealth. It starts to filter our behavior. When inflation is high, people with nothing to lose are pushed toward risk-taking, while those with something to protect become risk-averse. This asymmetry concentrates advantage. Those with capital can afford to wait, hedge their bets, and maneuver. Those without it are forced to act immediately, often out of desperation. Time itself becomes a luxury good. Policy discussions rarely frame inflation this way. They talk about targets, expectations, and credibility. These terms sound neutral, technical, and responsible, but credibility means something very specific. It means markets believe inflation will continue at a controlled level. It means asset prices can be reliably forecast. It means debt can be serviced. It means the system's promises remain believable. The public cost of maintaining that credibility is spread across the entire population, while the private benefit is concentrated in the hands of a few. This is why inflation is often tackled with tools that hurt labor more than capital. Raising interest rates slows hiring long before it slows asset inflation. Recessions are used to correct wages long before they correct ownership imbalances. The burden is never shared equally, and because inflation works through prices rather than laws, resistance is fragmented. People blame corporations, they blame politicians, they blame global events, or they blame themselves. The system itself remains an abstract concept, and accountability is impossible to pin down. This ambiguity is what protects the structure. By the time inflation becomes politically dangerous, it's a temporary spike or an external shock. Relief is promised. Small adjustments are made, and the narrative resets, but the underlying transfer of wealth never reverses. Wealth that moves upward rarely trickles back down through the same channel. Asset prices don't deflate easily without a major crisis. Debt forgiveness is politically difficult, and wage gains always lag, even during economic recoveries. Inflation ratchets inequality upward and locks it in place. This is why periods of high inflation are often followed by periods of consolidation. Companies merge, markets concentrate, and ownership narrows. What was once distributed becomes centralized. Inflation clears the field for the biggest players. Those who survive emerge with greater scale and influence. Those who fall behind are either absorbed or excluded. Control doesn't require malicious intent when the outcomes are this predictable. The system doesn't need villains. It just needs incentives that align power with stability. And inflation does that perfectly. It disciplines the labor force without overt repression. It rewards asset ownership without explicit favoritism. And it allows debt to be sustained without mass defaults. Because it operates continuously, it slowly reshapes our expectations. People stop demanding stability and start adapting to instability. They budget differently, they plan for the future less, and they accept volatility as the new normal. And when instability becomes normal, control becomes invisible. At that point, inflation is no longer debated as a problem, it's managed as a parameter. It's adjusted, guided, and anchored. That very language reveals the shift. You don't anchor something you want to get rid of, you anchor something you depend on. This is the quiet truth behind inflation policy. The goal is not zero inflation. The goal is tolerable inflation high enough to keep debt and asset values afloat, but low enough to avoid a public revolt. Finding that balance determines whose lives get tighter and whose get to expand. When inflation rises above that tolerable level, it triggers unrest. When it falls below what's necessary, it threatens the solvency of the entire system. So the system oscillates between these two boundaries, always choosing outcomes that preserve its own survival. Individual hardship is an acceptable cost, systemic disruption is not. Seen this way, inflation isn't a failure of governance. It's a feature of governance in a debt-based economy. It transfers wealth upward, it enforces dependency downward, and it stabilizes the entire structure in between. It does all of this without ever announcing itself as a form of power. The most effective systems of control rarely do. They operate through incentives, not commands, through slow erosion, not sudden seizure, through time, not force. By the time people realize that inflation is shaping their future, that shape is already set. They're told to adjust their expectations, to retrain for a new job, to relocate to a new city, to consume differently. But rarely are they told to question why value itself moves the way it does, because once you see inflation as a mechanism rather than a mishap, the entire story changes. You stop asking when prices will go back down, and you start asking who benefits when they don't. That question leads somewhere deeply uncomfortable. It leads to the realization that freedom in a debt-based economy is conditional. It exists only within the parameters defined by inflation, credit access, and asset ownership. Outside those parameters, your choices narrow dramatically. Inflation doesn't take your freedom away all at once. It just puts a price on it, and as that price rises, fewer and fewer people can afford it. That is how inflation quietly transfers wealth upward, and how without ever declaring itself it becomes one of the most powerful tools of control. Thanks for watching. If this gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing for more videos that look beneath the surface of our world.